We're going to be talking about midpoint in this video. Midpoint is a point that bisects a segment into two equal parts. So you could think of it as if I have if I have an entire segment, the point right in the middle, that's going to be considered my midpoint. And this is going to be very useful because you can use that midpoint to determine two equal lengths. You can use the midpoint to find a missing endpoint. There's lots of things you can do. And on a number line, you could think of it being right in the middle. Okay, so same thing. So we're going to just go through some examples using midpoint, and then that'll be it for today. The first example says, find the coordinates of the midpoint, ST, if the point S is negative 6, 3, and the point T is 1, 0. You could do this on a graph. If you had a grid already and it was straight up and down or horizontal, by all means, just count halfway. But a lot of these segments are going to be slanted, and so you can't do that. So the easiest way to calculate the midpoint is to think of it like an average. So we're going to take the average of the x's and we're going to take the average of the y's. And in order to find the average, it's basically adding the x's together and dividing by 2 because there's 2 x's. And same with the y's. Add the y's together and divide by 2. And our answer, remember this is a point, so our answer has to be written as an ordered pair. So that's very important. It's different than distance, which is just one number. Midpoint is a point. So I'm going to go ahead and label this as x1, y1, x2, y2, just so you know the difference. It doesn't really matter. And then we're just going to plug into our formula. So we'll have negative 6 plus 1 divided by 2. And then on the other side, 3 plus 0 divided by 2. And if I simplify that, we get negative 5 over 2 and 3 over 2. And you're welcome to leave it in fraction form. So if you change it to decimal form, this would be the same as negative 2.5 and then 1.5. And obviously that would be a little bit more difficult to count on a grid, so it's easier to just plug it into the formula. So there's your midpoint. Okay. The next one says find the measure of the length or measure of PQ if Q is the midpoint of PR. So this is knowing what that midpoint does. A midpoint, remember we said, splits a segment in half. So if we know that the point Q is in the middle, that means that PQ and QR have to be equal lengths. And that's what those dashes right there mean. Okay, if I have two segments marked with the same dash, that means that they are congruent to each other, they're equal. So now that allows me to take this equation and this equation, because I know they're equal lengths, and set them equal to each other. So I'd have 9y minus 2 is going to be the same length or equal to 14 plus 5y. And now it's just a matter of solving. So I could subtract 5y over, and that gets us 4y minus 2 equals 14. Add 2 over, we get 4y equals 16. And then divide by 4, we get y is 4. Now remember, they didn't care about y. They wanted the length or the measure of PQ. So I just got to plug y back into my equation, and we'd say that PQ is equal to 9y minus 2. So that gets us 9 times 4. And then we could just simplify. So 36 minus 2, that means PQ's length is 34. And then if it had units, you'd obviously want to include the units as well. So 34 is our actual final answer, and then we'd be finished. Now the last thing that we're going to practice is using the midpoint to find an endpoint that we need. This is basically working backwards. So here it says find the coordinates of the endpoint if you know one endpoint is negative 9, 7 and the other is 10, negative 3. So you can still think of it as plugging in what you know. Okay. So remember our midpoint formula, x1 plus x2, and then y1 plus y2, and then that's going to end up with some midpoint there. Okay. So when we label this, one of our endpoints here, let's call this x1 and y1, but you can't call this x2 and y2 because that's the midpoint. So it's going to go here and here. So when we fill in our equation, it's going to look like this. Negative 9 plus some x value divided by 2. Okay. And our x value over here is 10, okay, right? Because that was our midpoint. So I'm going to set my x equation equal to 10. And I'm going to do the same thing with my y value. We know that my y1 was 7, so 7 plus some other y endpoint divided by 2. Well, that's going to have to equal negative 3 at the end because the end goal was our midpoint. Okay. And so now I have two equations set up, one for the x, one for the y, so that I can find them to write what the missing ordered pair was. And this is just a matter of solving. So to solve these, I'm going to get rid of this 2 by multiplying on both sides. And then when I do that, I'm going to be left with -9 plus this x equals 20. And then I could add 9 over, and that gets x equals 29. And then same thing over here, these cancel, so I'm left with 7 plus y equals -6. Subtract that -7 over, and we get y is equal to -13. So my ordered pair here that I was missing would be 29, -13. And then you'd be done. And you could check your work, take that endpoint we just got, and then use the other endpoint they gave you, find the midpoint, and see if you end up with 10, -3. So it's the same formula, it's just a little extra work because you're working backwards. Okay? If you have any questions over any of the examples from this video, let me know, but you should be good to go. Thanks for listening.